This is a production of Cornell University.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Cornell Turf Show. We've been sort of in and out last couple of weeks, but we'll get going back on the horse here for this week and next week to finish off our spring, almost summer season now. Today's guest, Dr. Bill Kreuser. Bill is the founder of Greenkeeper app. Bill, I don't know if that's the exact right term, but Bill also manages the Jamaica golf course. We're talking about pre-show, some of the greens there, and some competitive tournaments playing on those fast greens up there in Nebraska. So we'll get some of Bill's thoughts today on, and probably using data on some of the management tactics he's really sort of pioneered and developed now that people can actually use, the practical application of these things. So we'll get to a conversation with Bill in a bit, but I'll hand it off to Frank for some of the opening thoughts today.
Well, we had a little event up here last week. I'm not sure everybody knew, not far from where I sit. Jeff Corcoran and the crew at Oak Hill Country Club delivered a absolutely spectacular PGA championship. And I know firsthand what that feels like, as I was intimately involved in the 2019 PGA championship down at Bethpage. It's an enormously exciting experience. Of course, the tweeting from the staff and then, of course, this guy absolutely lit the place on fire. And I think rejuvenated a fair amount of interest in golf again for a lot of people. And big shout out to Groton native and former employee of the Robert Trent Jones Golf Course, Jeff Corcoran, a local guy who's now made Oak Hill his somewhat permanent residence. And I think all of us in this business really marveled, particularly at the grass around the bunkers. I know at Bethpage, with the large bunkers there, managing that bluegrass, managing that turf around those bunkers gets really hard. And I thought Jeff and the crew did a spectacular job. But on a serious note, Chris Harriman down in the Mid-Atlantic posted a tweet about some skin cancer, and of all places, behind his ear. Right? You wouldn't think that'd be necessarily a place, but wear those bucket hats. Listen. Sun exposure as we get into the season is a big deal. It's a part of the hazard, a workplace hazard associated with this line of work. So just a shout out there, Carl, before I pass it on to you, that safety first. And I know you've got a rant here about pesticide use reduction, and let's hear it.
Yeah. So Frank, we've had these conversations with our New York State Park golf course superintendents for many years. They are focused on obviously providing playing conditions for their players that reach a certain level every day. But being state parks, they're interested in the products they're applying and trying to reduce that as much as they can while still maintaining those playability thresholds. So we talk a lot about, hey, what's our pesticide use? We measure pesticide risk. And one of the big things we've learned over the years, we've published a couple articles on this now, is that your pesticide applications to the larger areas of the golf course, the fairways and the rough, really sort of add up when it comes to the total pounds of pesticide use or the total risk compared to greens, right? We treat greens a lot more often, but hey, if we've only got 3 acres of greens and 30 acres of fairways, right? The pesticide use on those larger areas is really sort of what drives pesticide risk. So today I wanted to talk about some of the IPM tenets we've used with state park superintendents, how we've gotten to reduce risk over the years. First one, scouting, right? Whether you're doing these check plots, I love the check plots. Bill's always tweeting about some of his check plots. You can see, hey, is the pest present? Or, hey, what did this product get me when I had applied it? And that's a really good way to figure out if it's worth it to apply it, right? So you see a couple here from some folks looking at disease, and hey, those applications we made worked. So that's how you know the disease is present. You also got to know maybe the timing of application. Ben McGraw just had him on the show last week, right? He was telling us some of the data he looks at. Phenological indicators are really good indicators of ABW progression over the year and how you treat that. He just tweeted the other day about the larvae coming up right on schedule, right? So all that's based on scouting and data. So now we have data like Ben's talking about, growing degree days, phenological indicators. This up on the screen is the Smith-Kearns dollar spot model, right? So now we have these pest pressure models that are pretty good maybe at figuring out when this pest is going to come and require treatment. So what we'd say is, hey, use that data and just monitor, right? Monitor that data, use your indicator areas, use your scouting, and try and pair that to figure out how you can use that data in the future, right? So Smith-Kearns, oh, if it's at 26% and I see dollar spot, okay, notice that over time, log that, and you'll start to look for those trends. So now, okay, you can do some of those things. You can get to pesticide reductions just doing some of those practices. But one thing we're looking at now at our state parks is let's incorporate some technology there, right? GPS sprayers. We did some work with Skinny Atlas Country Club a few years back, looked at their product usage before and after they put a frost ink sprayer on their existing unit, and they saw reductions. Fairway product used about 15%. Greens was a little bit higher, 30%, rough about 10%. So you're looking at across the course, 15 to 20% product savings. That means less pesticide use. That's really good. No surprise why that happens, right? You eliminate the overlaps, you eliminate the sort of the triangles on the edge. You're trying to stick a square peg into a round hole essentially with the manual sprayers. So that's a really easy way, some low-hanging fruit. You obviously got to make some investments for that. And that helps you spot treat. So another interesting thing I've picked up on over the years, Paul Koch at UW-Madison and their University Ridge golf course set up these weather monitoring stations on 2 different holes, the 9th and 18th holes, and they consistently measured 15% higher dollar spot pressure on their 18th hole, which is really sort of this wall of trees, sort of restricting air movement and shading that fairway compared to the 9th hole, which is way out in the open, a lot of air movement, right? So if you're treating these fairways, 5-6 times a year, maybe for something like dollar spot, hey, does that 9th hole always need that dollar spot spray? Maybe that's something to think about. Again, that's maybe 4 acres. You can start cutting some product usage down. And then I love this image, Bill. This you tweeted this out maybe a couple months ago, but basically for those who can't see, this is a GPS application. You can sort of look back on Google Maps. Hey, where did I make this application? This incorporated a lot of things, right? You can see there's only specific parts of the golf course that get this application in the rough, couple tees. It's not widespread, right? So there's some scouting involved there, I think, Bill. So you're using some data. It looks like a pre-emergent application here for nutsedge. You can see that initial application sort of in purple. And then there's sort of a pink application, which looks like a post-emergent sort of touch-up, again, using scouting, and that's even a smaller area. So this really incorporates a lot of the things we love to see when it comes to pesticide use reduction and controlling those pests really effectively, right? Where is the pest? When is it present? Combining all of those IPM tactics and technology to reduce our product and pesticide usage.
So Bill, does Frost Sprayer generate this image, or do you have to draw it?
Good question. So this is how this happens. So nutsedge is something that we know we get better control right as it's emerging. Post-emergence, it's a perennial warm season grass or sedge, sorry. And so when it pops up, you need to go out with some of the different chemistries. I think I've used sedge hammer the last couple of years. If you wait until you see it everywhere, your control is bad. So in year 1, which was now 3 years ago, we were later, early June, really obvious, marginal control. But then in the subsequent years, we've used that map from the first year to then roughly draw out where we see it. So instead of targeting 30 acres of rough, I'm just hitting now 3 acres of where I've saw it last year. And then by doing that over and over, this really tough perennial weed that used to be widespread is now been minimized through 3 years of targeted applications right where it is, hitting the same spots. And so where it's a little bit darker, intense purple, that's where we made a second application where we saw some breakthrough. And so all the GPS sprayers, like the one from Frost, they can export their shapes. And so you can see exactly where you sprayed. And then in Greenkeeper now, we're actually being able to import those and then draw boundaries right in those spots so that you could even just send someone out. They just drive around and they just automatically hit all of these areas because you can look down at it, see what you sprayed last year, target those spots. We've even made it now too so that you can drive around in your golf cart and circle weed areas or pest areas and make real-time polygons so that you can make targeted sprays for things like spring dead spot, weeds, any type of pest that is perennial and is at a pretty similar location, and therefore really reduce the amount of product you're applying.
This is great, Bill. So listen, let me get through some weather because I got some PGR stuff to talk about. And I'm always apologetic for taking you away from the PGRs for a few years to come and study with us here. And then so glad that you got back at it. Now, listen, everybody in the Northeast has been pretty aware that we're still on the cool side. It was a cooler than normal week last week, which, I think in many ways has slowed growth almost as much as the dry conditions. So a little bit cooler than normal. Soil temperatures continue to stay in the high 50s, low 60s. Particularly along the coast, it started to cool off. Obviously, the 2-inch soil temperatures are going to respond to the air temperatures pretty uniformly. So, we're still seeing a slowing of the progression of the growing season. And again, as a measure, the real story is how dry it's been. Now, east of New York State and into New England, particularly in southeastern New England, Connecticut and Rhode Island along the Cape, got a lot of rainfall. We stayed pretty much on the dry side here. We had a little bit of rain. And of course, everybody that watched Oak Hill for a couple of days over the weekend saw the persistent rain that they got. And you can see in this particular image, if you're watching on News Channel 8 here, that that rainfall was really localized in the Rochester area. But because there was no heat and electricity associated with it, they just played right through. And obviously those wonderfully coarse sand greens that they redid when Andrew Green went in there and redid the place drained exceptionally well. When you look at overall deficits, you're starting to see a pretty good deficit start to form in the metropolitan New York area and really throughout the Northeast. Really the only wet spot left is in the mountains of West Virginia. So dry continues to be the story. And that looks like it's going to persist, except we're going to get quite a bit warmer. There's pretty widespread agreement that we're going to be 10 to 12 degrees above normal next week, well into the 80s, almost every day. So we're going to have the temperatures in place. The question is, are we going to get the growth? Now, just a note, because we had Ben last week talking ABWs, Albert Kopenhofer from Rutgers made a comment about larval conditions, rhododendrons. You ought to be looking to make your larvicide applications if you haven't done that yet. But I thought in his blog post, the particular language around pyrethroid resistant populations, larvicides behave differently depending on whether you had a high level of pyrethroid resistance or not. And there's a variety of products available, Tetrino, but not Soprato. Soprato not available in New York State. Tetrino is available. Ference and Matchpoint also available. Provant might be a better choice for highly pyrethroid resistant populations. And again, dry weather, we're not sure how it's going to affect ABW, but we all know annual bluegrass doesn't necessarily like dry weather. So this may lead to some increased injury. Now, seed head flushes out and about on the golf course. I was out in East Aurora Country Club on Monday, and you can tell we're in major seed head flush right now. So, Bill, I got to tell you, I'll bring you in here. You just sort of tweeted this morning. Really appreciate it. I was so happy to see this now available in Canada. Part of what I wanted to focus on with you today was Anu. And honestly, I've been at it a game a little bit here. I was not aware that Anu was an effective product for seed head suppression. I don't know if it works alone, but you've got some data here. You and Kaminsky just a couple of years ago did some work looking at Anu for seed head suppression. Can you take a minute and talk a little bit about Anu and seed head suppression?
Yeah, it's I think it's still a little bit of an unknown. In this here, we still have Anu with proxy, just like you would use a Prima with proxy. So the proxy is still your bigger driver, but as one of our colleagues, Doug Soldat, he was applying Anu at a course in Madison last year without proxy and still seeing pretty good control. And so there's some data out there. It's not consistent, but just like proxy is not consistent. This year, I hit my timings. I didn't get a fall app, which was really important because we went from like 85 in middle of October to like 30 in the end of October. And it wasn't in the cards. And my control was pretty bad this year, but then the courses down next door that made the fall app had great control.
Right.
So the timings are probably important, and it's probably similar with the Anu. And so I think there's a lot more we need to learn about what Anu alone would do for seed head, but it is a good reason to consider Anu with proxy. I do like to do proxy by itself though, first app, because usually your first app, the grass is just breaking dormancy, and then come in with a new proxy, maybe on your second app, 200 growing degree days, base
Okay.
0 later.
So Canada, I mean, I thought this was a wow, because Canada doesn't have proxy or Embark or any of these other things. So if a new turns out to be on its own something you can put out in the fall like a proxy app, and then maybe in the spring, that's going to be a big deal for Canada. Now, listen, annual bluegrass, when it starts flowering, and this is all speculative from Al Turgeon's perspective, when you get this seed head flush, you get a cessation in rooting, as he would speculate here. Now, annual bluegrass has a more uniform growth rate during the season, at least theoretically. Bentgrass, much slower to get going, although I will say I saw a lot of bentgrass going earlier this year, and I think some of it was because the proxy just knocks the crap out of the annual bluegrass, and you can see the creeping bentgrass sneaking through. So, Bill, as we transition to growth, I always start out with growth potential. I know it's not everybody's favorite thing on a weekly or daily basis, but over the course of the year, you can see if we're going to average, looks like we're going to average in the low 60s this coming week. It's still going to get cool at night, but be really warm during the day. You're really getting towards where the growth potential model indicates you're going to get maximum growth. Now, with maximum growth, when you start to collect clippings, Carl's done this a number of years now, where you can see the bottom lines here are more uniform, a little bit less blipping, probably some growth regulator use on these greens, and the green line above, maybe not good PGR use. I know that's a very similar line that we see at the Vineyard Golf Club, where they can't use growth regulators out there. So, Bill, just so that everybody knows, a good primer, I know it's old now, it's probably 8 years old. You wrote this article back in 2015. It's still probably one of the more comprehensive articles we can find if people really want to understand the effective use of growth regulators. So I don't know if you have anything newer than that, but the thing that jumped out at me and what I wanted to chat with you about is I'm hearing the sales folks are getting good now at getting people on a new. I think at first people were like, primo, I like primo, I like what I get. And then, they started to say, well, maybe you don't have to treat as much. And you look at your, growing degree day model here. And I guess essentially what you'd say is it pretty much, lasts longer. And again, in your Greenkeeper app, you've done a spectacular job in really helping people, if they're able to collect clippings and make routine applications, looking at the overall growth regulation you're going to get from something like a new with a little bit of trim it. And then a lot of guys are putting their summer patch and drenches on now with DMIs, and you're going to get that, additional growth regulation associated with it today. And so what you've done exceptionally well is saying, okay, you use all these things individually, you get this, collectively, you can get 60 to 70% growth suppression, which, you start getting a lot of traffic, especially in walk-on, walk-off areas, and you're getting 60% suppression, you might start to see some thinning in the highest traffic areas. Now, Bill, the thing I'm most excited about is this machine learning business, where you're looking at predicting growth based on weather, predicting growth, looking at nitrogen and traffic, predicting growth, adding a sensor. And we're going to work with you this year, putting one of the sensors on our mowers out at RTJ. And then ultimately the goal is, I would hope, to get to this point in your Greenkeeper app where you can put this data in, get some of this additional data, start to train the machine to be able to predict what's going to happen every day, maybe even without taking the data anymore. I know ultimately that's going to be your goal here, but let's start the conversation with the new. Guys like mixing, I put a little new, I put some primo, and you got Three Musketeer, you got all the different types of combinations that are out there. How do you talk about a new to people who might not have used it before, and the kinds of responses and performance you're seeing with it?
Well, I think generally, if you think about the different grass species on your bent POA surfaces at greens height, it lasts a little bit longer and you get a little bit more suppression than, say, your primo. In fairway height grasses, they're very similar to each other. And then also into your athletic field heights, so primo and new seem to work about the same.
Okay.
You go into the Bermuda grass warm season arena, and the Anu actually lasts half as long, which has worked well, because a lot of times in those environments, people like to make weekly or more frequent applications. And so that shorter lasting and new leads to less overregulation, because you're not doing what you termed initially as stacking, or this kind of accumulation. So every species is different, and we're doing this work for Anu, and now for all the DMIs. We're doing in the warm season research areas this year with Kearns and Chase Straw on Seashore Paspalum and Zoysia and Bermuda grass, to really understand how all of these products are working. But ultimately, every grass, every active ingredient works differently. A benefit of mixing, though, is you get an additive effect. So if you increase the rates of these PGRs, you're going to see more suppression. Sometimes the label's so restrictive, you really can't increase rate much. So in order to get more suppression, you have to start layering them on top of each other. So I use Anu and trim it at my golf course to really suppress the growth rate. I do Anu at a flat standard 8-ounce rate. And then I'll vary my trim it rates based on the performance of my turf. So if I'm seeing a lot of growth, I'll go up 12, 16 ounces of trim it. If I'm seeing low growth like right now, I do a 4-ounce rate of trim it. And so I'm adjusting those PGRs to help keep my clipping volume where I want it to be. When I'm in that ideal range, the greens are fast, but they're also recovering from 26,000 rounds in essentially two months. And so that's where I'm trying to balance, is get that growth rate where it needs to be. Use the PGR as a tool to help me stay in that range.
Okay, so let me make sure I got this right. Anu has some rate restriction issues in your mind that might prohibit you from raising the rate to get more inhibition.
Actually, it's more of primo. Like on primo, you're stuck at a 5.5 ounce per acre rate on greens. There is a little bit of text below that allows you to increase or change that rate slightly. But in order to really see a dramatic increase in suppression from, say, primo, you'd have to be up at 3/4 of an ounce, which is 6 times label rate. And we've done that research. It doesn't kill the grass. Everything's fine. But instead of 20% suppression, you get 40% suppression. That's the same amount of suppression you get out of trim it at a high rate. So,
okay,
you know,
so then, okay, but then the question comes, why mix it? Why not just use, I mean, I know guys that'll put on fairways, they'll put 24 ounces to trim it per acre, right?
Well, you can. And so one thing that you might see some phytotoxicity, although all these products can be phytotoxic, is you start to get your growth rate to be too low. And so that's a concern, but sometimes you can't go at that high of a rate legally. And so if you're stuck at that rate, then you can do that mix. Other times too, like if I'm doing a root application, I'll use the trim it in there. And then if I come back a week later with foliars for disease, I'll throw just the Anu in. And so I can layer those products as needed. And like that Graphew and Greenkeeper, I can then see what the combined effect of mixing all of those DMIs, proxy, and PGRs together are doing. So Anu is it's more tough on the POA than your primo is going to be. It's more similar to like a cutless than it is a trim it. It's kind of right in the middle. So we see about 30% suppression at that 8 to 12 ounce rate, where we're seeing about 20% or less at a 5-ounce rate of primo.
So
again,
it's a little more like primo in this, because in this tweet recently, shifting carbohydrates to plant roots, improving quality. I mean, I know that's what New Farm is saying. Is that's because it's an early blocker like primo? Talk to me a little bit about
blocker.
this.
Both of them are late blockers.
Late blockers. Sorry.
Do that. If the plant is making so much sugar, and so if you're preventing from unnecessary top growth, then you have more sugar to drive rooting to make it healthy. The graph you showed before of bent grass, where it just grows like crazy, and then the roots really diminish during the summer. A lot of that is because bent grass is a little silly. its maximum growth potential from a clipping perspective is when the average air temperature is in the upper 70s. Well, from a physiology perspective, it's not making much sugar at that level. So then what happens is if you over fertilize, then you're pushing all this vertical growth. There's no sugar left over to drive rooting. So that's why in the summer, or in this graph here, we see a lot of rooting in the early spring, because it doesn't start making a lot of vertical growth until it gets into the upper 70s for average temperatures. So that's temperatures in the highs of 90. That's what the bentgrass likes to grow vertically. The POA is on the other side. It wants to grow vertically when the temperatures are about averaging around 60. So it's actually on the other side of peak sugar. So when you look at that pace growth potential, that is the potential to make sugar. Cool season grasses is around 68, 70 degrees average temperature. And so as those growth rates deviate from that, that's when the problems start to occur. That's why things like bentgrass in the Carolinas can't make it through the whole summer, because it loves the heat. It literally grows itself to death like a dandelion treated with 2,4-D. And that's why if we can use the PGRs to suppress the growth rate, keep just enough growth there to recover from traffic, then we can prolong how much carbohydrate we have to survive those stressful periods.
Okay, so let's move to the future here, and where we want to train the machine to help us with this. There's two things on my mind before I get into this even deeper. When you said a new is more like Cutlass and somewhere between Cutlass and Trim It, you like it? It's harder on the POA, and I think of Cutlass as easier on the bentgrass. Trim It can be pretty nasty to bentgrass. Cutlass a little easier on the bentgrass. You're saying a new, if you're using it sort of to really sort of keep your POA at bay or not see it expand, you like it as maybe a little bit more aggressive than Cutlass, but not as aggressive as Trim It.
Exactly. And the other thing too about this is why I hate doing any aggressive cultivation or any even fertility when the average air temperatures are 60, because the POA has the competitive advantage during those weather events. And so anything you're doing, you think you're helping to promote bentgrass, is really promoting POA, because the bentgrass's average temperature for growth is in the upper 70s. And so this time of year, I'm trying to minimize whatever I can do to keep that competitive POA from taking over the less competitive vent. Then it's the summer, I'll switch it around. More venting, more top dressing, literally bury the POA to death, fertilize more when the bentgrass wants to grow and encroach on that POA, and then use these PGRs to further weaken that plant, because it is a little bit harder than, say, your Primo would be.
Okay, so Carl and I, and here at Cornell, and our new employee Chase Scrubus, we're all about being more data driven and being able to predict these things. We would like superintendents to be a little bit more predictive and anticipatory of these things. I know this has evolved for you, and I know Greenkeeper is giving you the platform to really utilize these things. I can look at data and see an R squared of 88 is better than an R squared of 61. Talk to me in practical terms. When you stand up in front of a group of golf course superintendents, and let's assume they're northern golf course superintendents, how do you get them to say, well, yeah, you can predict? Why should you even have to predict this? I can measure it, Bill. You just got me on measuring the damn thing. Yeah. We're finally getting them to put it in the bucket. And now we're saying, well, we can predict it. How do you sell this to folks to tell them why predicting this is going to give them a bit of an advantage?
Because when you're sitting there making those decisions as to, do I need to fertilize, or how much PGR do I need to put in the tank today? Do I need to mix those PGRs together to get more or less suppression? Should I use a more aggressive or less aggressive fungicide? You have to make an assumption of, well, where is your growth going to go over the next 2 to 3 weeks? And if you don't know, you can easily overdo it in one direction. So from our intuitive nature of managing golf courses, we know when we start getting frost, that growth rate is going to really die off. But say you didn't know that, and you're using your full summer PGR programs, and it's going to be cold the next 3 weeks, you would easily overregulate your turf. But because you know that, well, we're going to have some frost, that's going to be nature's PGR. Maybe I'll just use a new by itself, right? That's an intuitive model based on your experience. That's all this is. It's just letting the computer brain bring in more factors than we can. And to just give you a kind of a little prediction. So we're actually working on building this right now. It's like a graph, and it kind of looks like the cone of what's that called? Like on hurricanes to know where's it going to hit.
Or the storm track. Yeah, the cone of
further.
uncertainty.
Exactly, cone of uncertainty. So we predict where it's going, and then we can kind of show that uncertainty grow. So at least you're getting some guidance as to, do I expect it to be going up or down? And then that helps me schedule. Do I need more or less PGR? Do I need more or less fertilizer? Should I maybe hold off on cultivation, or maybe I need to get some sand out next week because I think it's going to grow like crazy? That's important guidance to help craft your program along and ultimately maintain your turf performance.
Well, and then and thank you for that perfect last line, turf performance. At the end of the day, the golf course superintendents are going to be judged on the performance of those surfaces, right? And you've got this really nice function in Greenkeeper where, you take some green speed measurements, you give it a simple turf quality, you collected a little bit of clippings. We are regularly getting soil moisture, surface firmness. A lot of this stuff we're going to get out of the GS3 moving forward. It's hopefully, in the future, we're going to see a lot more integrated platforms, because right now, you guys and Deacon are sort of at the head of the game here. I think ultimately this is what guys want to do. How hard is this to do, Bill? Do you get a lot? I mean, you have a lot of users now on Greenkeeper, a lot of premium users that might be beginning to embark on this. I know you've really been working on getting these performance measurements and then ultimately predictions moving forward. What's the adoption been about this use of this for performance? And ultimately, what are some of the things that you've learned so far with guys that are using it?
I think I'd say don't knock it till you try it. Everybody it's one of those things, like you say, Doug Soldat would say, if you use a TDR meter and you don't like it, I'll buy it back from you. And he's never bought one back. It's one of those things too, where once people start entering their clipping data and even their green speed data every day, it becomes a habit, and it becomes really powerful and useful to understand. Do they need to roll more? Do they need a double cut? Can they maybe skip a mowing? And so that's an immediately practical aspect of it. By tracking clippings every day, we know what the end of year clipping yields look like. Therefore, we can predict how much fertilizer you've removed to make sure that your additions are roughly equal to your removal, to make sure you're being efficient. And then again, we get that guidance as to what do we need to do from a management perspective to either manipulate growth rate. So
I mean,
by writing this down, you'll quickly figure out where that value is. And so people that have been doing this, they see the value of 2 minutes a day to then help make better management decisions.
Okay, because what I'm hoping for, much like the machine learning part, is that this is also going to help the machine, that on any given day, you'll be able to say, if I've done this and the weather conditions are this, and this is a pretty typical day that I'd see, I can expect these greens to perform like this. I'm assuming this is then going to give us a lot of confidence overall in not even having to take the data forever, because the machine will have learned a bit.
Yep. And it's done in your course. And we've actually improved upon this, Frank, like a couple of weeks ago now, where you can, before you go to this page, you've optionally enter management data. How much irrigation, mowing height, did you mow, did you roll, did you double roll? How many hours has it been since that, from when you took the measurements? All of those are going to be important pieces to let the site know how does your green speed respond to double mowing versus single mowing. And so those are some of the big things that we're doing with the machine learning. So we have 2 developers working on that right now for the summer. And then my other developer is working on the GPS sprayer map feature. So that if you have a GPS sprayer, you need to edit your boundaries, group them differently. You can import them right into Greenkeeper, edit them, and then export them right back to your sprayer. And that's been a big limitation in the hardware is there. We needed the software, and we're hoping to launch that in the next couple of weeks here to pull in all that spatial data and edit those GPS sprayer maps.
Well, we're all in. We're getting the frost spray unit on our sprayer here for Chris and Todd at the RTJ, and looking forward to getting the sensor hooked up on the mower. I know that there's another company doing this as well. So I'm really pleased, and, not that you need competition, but in general, I'm really pleased that this is becoming more mainstream. We got off the hype of drones, and now we're back on to actually measuring things on the ground. Years before I let you go, and Carl, if we can take a minute for questions. How's the sensor been working preliminarily?
We've used it for 5 years, and in Michael Carlson, my PhD student who now works for our company, he showed that we reduce fertility by 80% at my golf course, which is relative to what my standard fairway program would have been. We only fertilize when we need to. We can do variable prescription maps with our variable rate sprayer. And so those years we've reduced by 80%. 1 year we didn't fertilize fairways at all. When you're managing bentgrass fairways, that's important. You don't want to have thatch accumulation. And so it's really helped me to look for trends, look for areas that need more fertilizer, like your collars or your approaches or specific collars, and just target those. And so this whole geospatial view will help. Your sensors coming to you. We're making the bracket right now. I have about a dozen more that are unaccounted for. So anyone out there wants some active sensors on their mowers, please email me and we can get you set up so that you can be bringing in that type of growth data from your fairway unit.
And Carl, like you said earlier, the 30-acre fairways, right? When you say you cut fertilizer that much, that's music to our ears, right, Carl?
And it's not just the environment, and we come at it from sort of a water quality environmental perspective, but that's costs, right? That is money you can spend elsewhere in your operation, right, Bill?
And the other thing on the sprayer savings is, the percentage of savings on fairways is less because they're bigger areas, bigger polygons, but it's a larger square footage, right? So greens might save 30% of 3 acres. That's a small square footage. Fairways is 10% of 30 acres. That's a lot of savings. So if you are looking to buy these technologies, if you're talking to your greens committee, think about those two different metrics. There's an actual total acreage saved, or there's a percentage saved, and use the one that's best to help sell.
Well, and it pays for itself pretty quick, Bill. I mean, once you get the sensor and you're talking about 80% reduction on fairways, and I'm, every time I fertilize, I'm treating 3 to 4 acres less. I pay for that sensor pretty quick, right, Carl?
Yeah, and you pay for the GPS. I mean, if you're a high-end sort of application golf course, you can pay for these things in literally a year and a half. That's how much you can.
And there's also the intangibles, the performance side. It's not just the savings. The grass looks better. We spray our collars and approaches separately from our greens. We don't have collar decline issues anymore as a result from PGR stacking on collars. That alone justified the cost. You can talk about fertilizer savings all day, but when my collars are alive, I'm not getting pressure from, my greens committee or my city manager of why is this looking this way? That is worth it. And so there's all kinds of intangibles on top of those fertilizer savings. And when I do say 80%, my normal program would have been about 0.08 of a pound every 2 weeks. And so that's what it would have been if I would have just, scheduled it out.
Yeah. Bill, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I know you're busy as hell with juggling a lot of things.
Thanks can I just say, if you're interested, greenkeeperapp.com, 7-day free trial, register. If any questions, help@greenkeeperapp.com to reach us. And thank you for the opportunity to talk on your podcast today.
Anytime. Carl, we're ready to go.
Yeah, it's this year it's been a little longest 30 minutes in turf, maybe this year. We haven't.
Sorry, guys.
No problem.
That's me.
It's an extra 10 minutes. I think it's well worth it today. So everybody 100%. Take care. We'll see you guys tomorrow. John Sorokin tomorrow, Sports Turf. So
talking FIFA.
FIFA, maybe Super Bowl. I don't know.
Yeah. See you, Bill.
Be good.
Hey, guys.
But everybody, take care.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.